Hi, everybody. This is Hannah Heath, the live events coordinator for BrightOnCon. I am excited to chat with author Natalie Whipple today about how to create I've already messed up right out of the gate. We're talking about how to create a strong supporting cast. Natalie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I love large ensemble casts, and I write them very often. So,
Yay, that's exciting. So for anybody who doesn't know, Natalie writes young adult fiction and has 10 books out, including Transparent, House of Ivy and Sorrow, Relax, I'm a Ninja, and then Vengeance Code, which is coming out this March. Natalie, can you tell us a little bit about Vengeance Code?
okay, the Vengeance Code. I haven't practiced this pitch, so we'll see how it goes.
I'm sorry to put you on the
Is,
spot.
if you're familiar with like Marie Lu's Warcross or Dan Wells' Blue Screen series, it's also a virtual reality, futuristic science fiction type thing in which esports comes into play, and it's about a girl named Linux, and her father invented virtual reality, but nobody knows because he was murdered and his code was stolen. So she's out for vengeance to fix her father's code, which is still broken, even though the people who stole it use it, and it damages people's brains and things. And she wants to restore her father's honor, basically, and take down the people who killed him. So, yeah.
Wow, that's so creative. I love it.
Yeah.
All right, so are you ready to get into talking about creating strong supporting casts?
Yes, I am.
All right, so first off, can you just define cast for us?
Sure. When I think of a cast in a book, I think of it much like in a play or a movie. The cast is every character who's in it, from the non-speaking roles to the main characters. So I try to take in everybody, which can be really overwhelming when you're building a world. I've been writing a lot of science fiction, and so that's like full on universe building at times. And when you have to think of all the people who exist in that world or that universe, it can get really overwhelming. But to me, it's really exciting because when I think of characters, I think of stories. Every character has a story, and you can play on all of those if you're aware of all the characters that are in your world.
Oh, that's fascinating. So cast, it doesn't just mean side characters, it's kind of an umbrella term that's the main characters, side characters, and everybody in between.
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. Um, so are so in your instance, you're talking about writing the sci-fi with lots of characters. Do you think that larger casts are better than smaller casts?
I would say it's kind of it's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, people who have smaller casts have a chance to really develop those people and dig deep, and it can be really difficult with big casts to get that same feeling of digging deep and really knowing those characters. And so you do have to be careful, and it is a hard balance. I don't think it's an easy thing to do to build a large cast. A lot of times people want you to cut characters. I've had many editors in my life wanting me to cut characters. Sometimes they're right, sometimes I don't agree. So I don't know. I don't think it's one is better than the other. I think it's really what your story needs. And sometimes a story needs a large cast, and sometimes a story doesn't need a large cast, and it's fine to have just a few characters. So.
Hmm. So in those instances when you've had editors suggest that you cut characters, when are instances when you think, oh yeah, this I definitely know this character needs to go, and how do you tell when you should keep a character and when that character needs to go?
I didn't really know how at first, but my agent, one of my first agents, Nathan Bransford, when he was still in the business, he was helping me with Relax, I'm a Ninja, and he pointed out that two of my characters filled the same role in the book. They were both kind of doing the same thing, and he's like, you don't really need two characters that are doing the same thing. And so that character really became like combined into one character to fill that role. So even if you have a large cast, you have to be thinking of what those characters fill in the book. They have to have a purpose. They have to be contributing to the story in some form. Otherwise, they're probably not necessary, or they're just really minor characters that don't need to be named, that don't need to be like given, all of the background information that sometimes we want to give them. So, yep, happened to me a couple times. A lot of times, editors or my friends will want me to cut groups of friends. I have this thing where I don't know, I just strongly dislike the whole there's the main character and they have their one best friend trope, because that's just really not how a lot of people work in this world. Like, we don't just have one friend. We usually have a circle of friends. As a teenager, I mean, I saw it. Like, everyone has their group of friends. You don't have just like your one best friend. Some people do, but for the most part, it's like you have 3 or 4 or 5. And I always want to capture that dynamic because I think it's more realistic, and I think it's an important dynamic to show. Because a lot of times those friendship within that circle can become really complicated and interesting. So yeah, I always push for those larger casts and those large circles of friends for that reason.
Right. Um, how when you do decide that you're gonna go for this large cast, how do you go about introducing them into the story so that everybody can, meet these characters and get to know them without it being overwhelming?
That's really hard. I'm not gonna lie. It's so hard because, yeah, it's a lot of people. You can't just go into a room. They're like, this is my 5 group of friends, and we're all going to talk, and I'm going to introduce each one and describe each one's, like, oh, it's going to get so confusing for the reader so fast. And you got to take it one step by one step, if you can. I try to kind of introduce one. You have a best friend even within your circle of friends. So I try to introduce a best friend or parents or the love interest one at a time. It seems one at a time. But it can be hard. I think in Relax I'm a Ninja, I start with a Dungeons and Dragons scene where he is playing with his group of friends. And so that was tough, but the way I tried to tackle it was to kind of give each character a really strong opposing appearance to each other. So, there was they had very distinct personalities, everybody in the cast. And so I tried to make it really clear those distinct personalities, but it was still, I don't know. I'm not sure if I pulled that one off, but I did my best. So
Yes.
I had regrets though afterwards. Oh, that was first chapter. Not a good idea, but
Hmm. So when you are giving them all these distinct personalities, do you have tricks for, keeping those separate? Like, do you do character tags or dialogue tags or anything like that?
well, I think the first and most important, it's a really subtle and small thing, but you need to make sure that their names are very different.
Huh.
Um, so, like, if you have people who have the same first letter in a name, like, you're gonna get those characters mixed up really quickly. And so I don't know why, but when I'm like instinctually naming people in a book, if I'm just coming up with names off the top of my head, I'll come up with names all of the same. Like, I'll have like a bunch of M names in one book or a bunch of T names in another book, and I look back and I'm like, why am I naming everyone, with this one letter? So I try to vary up the names. I try to have different letters starting their names, different amounts of syllables, all these things to try and make sure the names are really distinct and different from each other, because that can be really confusing. Um, and then past that simplicity, um, I think it's really important to like focus on a couple characteristics of that character. So you can't just go and list all of the things that are what they look like. You got to list that one thing that makes them really stand out. That they really rock those, thick bright purple glasses or something. So you're like, okay, that character is the one with the bright purple glasses, and that character is the one who does this. In Transparent, it was kind of easy because they all had superpowers. So
Oh,
you could kind of remember them by what their abilities were, and so that was an easier way to do that. So like, okay, he's the strong one. She's the one who can mimic voices. She's invisible, that sort of thing. So that guy has
right.
flat eyes and he can see in the dark. Yeah.
That's awesome, and that's really helpful too. I notice a lot of books tend to do that with the names. It's interesting. I wonder why people kind of err on the side of, just choosing a letter that they like and then going with that for all their character names.
But when you're drafting, you just don't really think it through, and then you look back and you're like, wow, that my brain just really got stuck on A. I don't know why.
Right.
Oh.
So you had mentioned kind of some of the difficulties with a larger cast, such as having extraneous characters, some characters that don't really serve any purpose. But what about when you have a smaller cast? What are some of the downsides to that, and how can you tell when your cast is too small?
That's interesting. It's a hard question for me personally to answer because I mostly always have a large cast. Like, I'm trying to think of any of my novels that have what I would consider a small cast, and I can't really think of one that I'm like, oh yeah, there's like 3 people in that book that are main characters. I'm like, no, they all have like, even I have in House of Ivy and Sorrow, she's an only child, but then I'm like, no, but she has like 2 best friends, and then she's got like her cousin witches, and then like the boy and all his friends, and I'm like, nope, nope, even the only child has a ton of people in her life. So I don't know. I think with small casts, I think it ends up maybe being a smaller story. I don't want to say like that's not a bad thing either. I'm not saying smaller story as in not a significant story. I'm saying smaller story and it becomes, like you're close up. You're zoomed in on these characters, and it can be a very personal story. When you have a big cast, it tends to be like a big world. You have like fantasy and science fiction, and these things sort of fit a larger cast, and contemporary tends to fit a smaller cast because you're focusing on somebody's personal life and events in their life. So I'm not sure when you can tell you have not enough. Maybe if you don't have enough story, like if you're writing and you can't get enough, length in your novel, maybe you're not filling it out with enough characters for that person to interact with. Uh, that might be a clue. I'm not sure. I'm really bad at this question, obviously. I'm like, small casts? What is that? I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
our viewers will, or our listeners will have to tell us, because I'm sure some of them will know more than I do on that one. Uh,
Right. Yeah, well, because I'm sitting here thinking, well, what are some books with a small cast? And I can't think of any at the moment. So maybe that's actually not a super big issue, which would be nice. One less issue for writers to
I
worry
think
about.
like Room would be a small cast,
Ah, yeah.
um, for sure. And some of the contemporaries, I mean, like I usually have 20 to 30 people named in my casts, and a lot of contemporaries can have a lot smaller of a cast, which is totally fine. It's not it's not wrong at all.
Right.
What
Yeah,
you
that's true. I guess if it's
necessary,
contemporary. Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. What you need to tell your story is what you need. So I guess I'm just greedy. I need a lot of characters.
So what are some symptoms of a weak supporting cast? Like if you're going back over your draft, what's something to look for to kind of that's a telltale sign?
Telltale sign is if you can't remember that person very well. um, if you're reading it and you're like, oh yeah, that character, I forgot about him. That would be a big sign. Like if you're just adding extra characters here and there, and you're like, oh, or if a character only appears in like one scene, with no other references, or like, I mean, sometimes a character can appear in one scene, like, an old wise sage who gives a prophecy, but then that's always talked about. you know, with the
Right.
rest of the book. If it's like one scene, the character makes an appearance and then disappears and there's nothing else that that character's doing, maybe that scene can be accomplished without that character. And you can remove it entirely and have somebody else fill that role. Um, Other signs of weak characters are if they're starting to blend together, like my reference from Relax I'm a Ninja, if they're filling the same role multiple times, um, probably one needs to get out there. And let's see, other signs of a weak cast. If people don't identify with them, like if and this is a hard thing to tell as you're writing, but like once you get critique partners or you get reader feedback, um, if people don't identify with the character or feel like they have any connection to them, sometimes that's a sign too, because even side characters or minor characters people like. If you think about like Harry Potter, I mean, how many side characters are in there that people just absolutely love? Like, we're still all crying over Cedric Diggory, who he was a character in one of the books, but he made such a big impact. So, side characters can have a lot of affection tied to them, even if they're not like the main character. So that's a good sign. If people are really attached to your side characters, that's a good sign that you wrote them well. So
Got it. Would you say that, the supporting cast needs to be as strongly developed as the main characters, or do you think that supporting casts can be kind of a notch down from the main character's development?
on the book level, like what the reader is actually seeing, the side characters should be less developed than the main character. Otherwise, I mean, you're going to have a really, really, really big book, which some fantasies do have. But um, usually the side characters are less developed on the page, but that doesn't mean they're less developed in an author's mind. So when I'm thinking of my side characters, and I write everything down. I like paper. I make a lot of notes. I actually sometimes draw my characters because I enjoy drawing. So, I try to develop my side characters and have them have motivations and have them have pasts that intersect with my main characters. And they have all of that there, but it doesn't all end up on the page like it does with the main character. So the author knows all those things about the side characters. It's just you just got to pick the best parts to put in the novel that stand out the most for side characters.
Got it. And is it important that the author knows the backstories for all of the supporting cast, even if those backstories don't make it in? Does that add, do
I
you think,
think it
richness
does.
to the characters?
Yeah, I think it does because people don't live in a vacuum. None of us live in a vacuum. We're all affected by the world around us. Even those people that are minor characters in our lives. I mean, you can go about your day, you know, and some person just kind of says something offhand and it can affect your entire day. And I like to think about that person and, you know, what is that person going through? Why did they say that thing that they said? Side characters are the same thing. They have feelings about the main character. They could have resentment for the main character. They can love the main character. They could feel both at the same time. And those types of feelings created by a shared past, things that happened to both of them, can make the story so much more interesting. So, yeah, I think the author does need to know those things to make a book that becomes in depth and realistic in the way people interact with each other.
Got it. And when you're developing those side characters, it sounds like you'd kind of develop them around the main character? Is that
Sometimes,
correct?
yeah, yeah. I tend to think in characters. I'm definitely a character-driven author. I always sort of the characters kind of pop up in my mind first before the plot, before the world around the characters. That's just sort of how my author brain works, and their relationships are the next thing that come into my mind for sure. So my characters and the characters that inhabit their world definitely are all kind of intermingled. And sometimes I design those characters specifically to be either a foil or a support. And sometimes it's a little more organic where I'm like, I know she's got this set of friends. I know he has this enemy. And it's a little vaguer, and then I kind of have to write it out to figure out why they dislike each other so much or why they're so connected. I just kind of follow. I guess you could, yeah, I'm one of those discovery writers sort of person. So my first drafts are very figuring out where everybody is and changing as I need to. So
Oh, so they're not just set characters, like, you don't just decide this is their personality, but they develop.
sometimes I get the main character wrong too. In Transparent, she's she's the perfect thief. She's invisible, right? And so her father, who is basically a crime lord, uses her to steal stuff and wants her to be an assassin, but that's why she leaves and escapes and is on the run. But she's the only invisible girl around, so she's kind of easy to find if you notice that she's there in clothes and you can't see her face. But she was really nice at first. The first draft I wrote as like really nice and really trusting, and like she easily made her friends, and I gave things to her very easily. And my agent was like, if this person grew up with a crime lord and was like forced to do all these horrible things for her whole life, I just don't think she would be a very trusting or nice person. Like, she'd be very prickly. And I was like, you're right. You're totally right. Of course you are. So in that case, I kind of had all the side characters right, but I didn't have my main character right. So I had to go in and kind of give her that distrust and that suspicion. Like, why are these people trying to be nice to me? Like, she doesn't understand the whole concept of friendship because she's been isolated her whole life. And so their interactions changed, even though the personalities of my side characters were the same, because her personality changed. And so they still ended up becoming friends, but it was more of a struggle. And I think it turned out much more interesting because it wasn't all just easy and perfect. So yeah, Agent was right on that one. But yeah, sometimes you get all the side characters right and your main characters wrong. So you never know.
Right. Editing, yay for editing.
Totally.
Um,
Change in editing too.
the what editing?
Characters change in editing, like as that example shows. And, you think you know your character, but then you write that first draft and you're like, oh, nope, I didn't.
Yeah.
So.
So when you are kind of trying to get to know your characters, do you have any kind of tips and tricks to keep track of all of your characters? Do you keep lists or do personality questionnaires or worksheets or anything like that? Or is
I really should. You would think I would have like a big list. With one of the science fictions that I've written, the first draft, I did start keeping a list because it's a space opera, so like big extra planets, lots of extra cultures and different, places and people. And so I did start keeping a list of characters because I'm like, oh, this is too many. And I was losing track of the people I was naming and where they were living and what they were doing. So I did start keeping a list just to kind of reference for myself. But I haven't really done a lot of keeping lists. I should. I'm not good at that. But yeah, that's why I can't remember most of my characters of my old books. Yeah, I would. Oh, if you gave me a quiz on all the characters in Transparent, which I originally wrote in 2010, I would not remember most of them. I'm quite sure. Because they have been replaced with all the characters of, subsequent books. So the characters that are in my head right now are of the book that I'm writing right now.
right.
So yeah. And then I forget the other ones until I have to go back and write a sequel or something else. I should write them down though. I would recommend that if you are writing a really large cast. And,
Got
I think a lot of fantasy and science fiction authors do that, um, especially when they have to switch between lots of points of view. They got to keep everyone straight where they are at, how their voice works, and what their motivations are. It can be really complicated.
right. Now you mentioned, that sometimes it's hard to remember characters when you're going back to write the sequels and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
So speaking of that concept, how do you if you have a large cast in the first book and then you're moving into the sequel, how do you decide which characters are gonna carry over into the sequel? Are you gonna add new characters? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes characters have to die. With a large cast has opened the opportunity for a lot more characters to die. So there are those things to be factored in. That sounds terrible, but sometimes that's the reality of large casts. I think we look at Game of Thrones and like, yeah, I mean, everybody who gets introduced ends up dying. So, uh, like, that's one way to kind of handle some of the excess, perhaps, or some of the people who may not have roles in the second book. The other way is when their storylines are resolved. Sometimes secondary characters have a strong storyline in the first book, but you can resolve those storylines just like you sort of end up resolving the first book. And maybe they go off and they're like, you know, I'm done here, so I'm gonna go hang out here. Maybe they'll come into play later, maybe they won't, but sometimes, there's an opportunity for them to be like, I'm out. So there's that option as well. Or sometimes you just gotta think of where that character is at the beginning of the second book and where they need to go. Because every character needs to have an arc. Every book needs to have characters that are changing and growing and hopefully improving. Some they don't have to improve. Sometimes they go downhill and in bad directions too. So you have to decide where those characters are going, um, and sometimes it's not pleasant. Sometimes it's death. Sometimes they turn into villains. Sometimes they're trying to support the main character, but they're disheartened or they feel neglected. I mean, there's so many things that you can do moving into a sequel with characters. I mean, oh man, there's so many good series to point to. I'll always point to Harry Potter because it's perfect. But Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of those too. I mean, they stick together through the entire series. You don't lose anyone of that core group, even though it's five. There's 5, 6 of them near the end. I mean, there's so many of them, but they all have their clear emotional arcs, and they all have things that they accomplish in every part of the series, and they all have their own struggles, and they all kind of help each other get through those. So, if you ever need an example of how to do it, look at Avatar or Harry Potter. That'll help you. That always helps me. So, yeah.
Awesome. That was actually my next question was, what are some of your favorite books with great supporting cast?
Yeah. Oh, there you go. I mean, it's so hard not to look at Harry Potter because, I mean, it's 7 books too. So, I mean, you just see how the characters grow and age and change, and I love that. Of course, I mean, another big one in the fantasy realm is Lord of the Rings. Huge cast, massive cast. I mean, people for days in that book, and if you do look at the different character arcs, it's really interesting to see how all of those people contribute to what the story outcome ends up being, even when they're separated by massive distances. They're all contributing. Um, Star Wars, love Star Wars. I will sometimes not mention books. I'm a weirdo because I like things like I consume a lot of different media, so I draw my stories from all over. But Star Wars, totally same thing. Massive cast, spanning many years and many different parts of that timeline in that world, and they managed to somehow connect it all, which is connected to the characters. those Jedi masters who live forever. You know, they kind of connect that wisdom and all of those things. I just like massively. What am I talking about?
That's all right.
Yeah, and Final Fantasy. Yeah, I love Final Fantasy. And those tend to have large casts. I'm a big video game player, so I grew up on those, and those really influenced my writing. And even if you only could have a few in your party, there was always a big cast of characters that you could pick, and they all had their own stories and all had their own side stories, and were all interesting and individual. Um, and maybe that's why I enjoy side characters so much from playing Final Fantasy video games throughout my childhood, because like, oh, the side stories, all the characters. I loved that aspect of the game. Instead of just being one character, you could like explore all these different stories that all kind of contributed to the main plot of the video game, which sounds crazy, but yeah, video games have plots sometimes. It's cool. And yeah, I think those are some of my favorites. I know they're like the stereotypical ones, but I think that's why they're so iconic and why so many people love them, because there's just so many characters to be loved within those universes. And I think that's why we come back to stories. I know I'm pro character, but a lot of times I think that's why we come back to stories, is for the characters we love that live in those worlds and somehow make it through. So
Yeah, I agree. Um, I think that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for chatting with us about the creating these supporting casts. So you had a lot of really cool tips, and now
well,
I'm excited. I have a Star Wars marathon this weekend, so now I'm going to pay close attention to all of the characters,
lucky.
so I can start taking notes on that.
Yep.
All right. So before you go, can you tell people where they can find you online?
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and my website is nataliewhipple.com. So that's not too hard to uh, forget. Natalie Whipple on Twitter. So yeah, I got in early on that. So I got my actual name. And
Nice.
yeah, not too hard to find me, I don't think.
Great. All right. So, again, thank you so much, everybody. This has been Natalie Whipple with Right On Con talking about how to create a strong supporting cast. So, Natalie, thank you again. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Bye.